I'm really honored to have this time together with you. For this chance to gather together and to think together about best practices around the role of treasurers and stewardship chairs and really church leaders as we think about giving and generosity and the fiscal management of our congregations. So as Lori mentioned, I'm the Generosity Outreach Officer in the national setting. I work with a team of people that are engaged in the philanthropic work of the United Church of Christ. And I have a particular focus on training and helping congregations and conferences think about how it is that we raise the funds we need to do our meaningful and important ministry and work in the world. In addition to that, I also work as the Director of Development for the Wisconsin Conference, so in a similar role in both settings in fundraising. Before I took on those roles, I served for over 20 years as a local pastor in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that is really where I learned the way in which we can faithfully engage in congregational-based fundraising. So I'm really delighted to be with you today as we think about these questions. Really, whenever we're talking about finances and questions of money management and resources and whatnot, I think it's really helpful to really root ourselves in the meaning of generosity itself. And so to keep clear about all of the things that we might talk about, whether it's software, which the conference staff and I were chatting about before the webinar began, or money management, or how to encourage people to be giving to the church, I always want us to root our thinking back in our own experiences of generosity. So what I'd like us to do is to start by sharing with one another an example of a time that we've received or have given a meaningful gift. I'd like you really to think about in the last week or two, what was a meaningful gift that you've either given or received? Really, that kind of question helps us to be aware of the place of generosity in our lives. And to be a meaningful gift doesn't mean that it was of high monetary value, but really that was of deep heart value. So a recent gift that my husband and I received, and my husband's recuperating from a ligament surgery. And so he's kind of cooped up and can't do much as he recovers from that surgery. And so a friend of ours sent him a puzzle so that he can sit at the table and work his puzzle as he tries to distract himself while he gets well. And it was a small gift, but it was a gift that meant a lot because it was a gift really of friendship and of knowing us and what was going on and of real care. So I want us to root ourselves in that kind of memories of generosity. We're going to go into breakout rooms of about 3 people. And I invite you to share with one another in those small groups. Introduce yourselves if you don't know each other, introduce yourselves, and then share that story of a meaningful gift that you've given or received. I really encourage you when you go back to your home congregation to think about using that as a question in one of your gatherings and to begin a church meeting with that. I particularly find that people often struggle with what might be called a mindset of scarcity when it comes to talking about financial questions. And we want to always be moving people to a place of a mindset of abundance. If there is one overall best practice, it is helping people make that move from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance. And so when we ask people to share those stories of times when they've either given or received a meaningful gift, it helps root people back into that place of abundance. I want to just say a few words about how I'm using those terms of scarcity and abundance. The biblical story that I think that might root us in what that contrast looks like is the story of the early disciples on Pentecost. You know, we don't normally think of this as a time of their mindset shifting from scarcity to abundance, but I think I hear that in the story because here those early disciples had spent 40 days with the resurrected Jesus. They had had all of this time with Jesus, and yet fear was still paramount in their heart. They were afraid, so afraid that they were locked in this upper room, afraid to go out, the doors barred. The Holy Spirit interceded for them, and they go out of that locked upper room. They're meeting new people, they're speaking in tongues, they're sharing their story. Now, it doesn't mean that life got easy for them. Abundance is different than prosperity. It wasn't like this was suddenly they had the magical existence and had won the golden ticket. No, I mean, Peter ends up in prison just a couple chapters later. But they had a feeling of abundance that freed them. When I think of that difference between scarcity and abundance, it is, I think, one of those moves that we need to make, both as leaders and within congregations, to always be rooting ourselves in a sense of abundance. Abundance isn't prosperity, but it is that freedom from fear that can overwhelm our hearts. So because of this importance that I place on generosity, I want us just to again, root ourselves in generosity. And this is, I'll share this definition around, I'll make a PDF available of our time together, and this quote will be in it. But this is a quote about generosity that you could use in another meeting to again root people in what generosity is about. It comes from Christian Smith, who wrote "The Paradox of Generosity: Giving we receive, grasping we lose." And this is how he defines generosity. I invite you just to listen and then to put into chat if there's any particular word or phrase that captures your imagination. He writes, "By generosity, I mean the virtue of giving good things to others freely and abundantly. Generosity, thus conceived, is a learned character trait that involves attitude and action, entailing both the inclination and actual practice of giving liberally. Generosity is not a haphazard behavior, but a basic orientation to life. It entails not only a moral good expressed, but also certain vices rejected, such as selfishness, greed, fear, and meanness. Generosity also involves giving not just anything, but rather those things that are good for others. What exactly generosity gives can vary: money, possessions, time, attention, aid, encouragement, emotional availability, and more. But it always intends to enhance the true well-being of the receiver." Again, I just invite you, if you want, to put into chat if there was a particular word or phrase that captured your imagination. Good things to others was one. What I like in this definition of generosity is how broad and expansive it is. What generosity gives can vary: money, possessions, time, attention, aid, encouragement, emotional availability, and more. I really love how it expands our concept of generosity. And I find that just helpful in my own life, to have that broad view of what generosity is. I want to turn now to think about the spiritual roots of our office, and what kind of biblical understanding can shape our idea of what it means to be a treasurer or chair of board of trustees, or to what it means to be a leader in our congregations. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute. So one day I came to my church, my local church, and there was this sign up, and it was during Lent. We work with a local community theater, and they were having auditions for a play, literally Judas auditions in the upper room. Now, I was there for a meeting of our board of trustees, and the irony of it just really struck me. And that is that, I think that often in the church, we kind of have this worry that the money people are gonna be the Judas person of the church. Judas was the person who carried the common purse for the early disciples. And we have that fear that we have to keep money and faith separate. So I want us to have an idea of the spiritual roots of our tradition, of our role, that can help us understand what we do in a new way. And I want to suggest that the story that can really help us is in Acts 6. So I'll set the scene because that may be helpful. In the story in Acts 6, the early community has grown and expanded. It's now a multi-ethnic movement. And in this case, the diversity is around people who are Hebrew-speaking Jews and those who are Greek-speaking Jews that are living together in Jerusalem. These are two different kind of cultural groups that are often in conflict. And this conflict arises in this early church, in the early church in Acts 6, because there's a feeling that in the distribution of resources, in the distribution of food, that the widows of the Greek-speaking Jews are getting left out. And so people come to Peter with a complaint of how to solve this. And he appoints deacons to take charge of the distribution of food. That is, to figure out how to equally or equitably share the resources of the community. That's a stewardship role. That's a trustees and treasurer's role. I would really invite you, as folks charged with finances in your local congregations, to think of your work as diaconal work, to think of yourselves as really living out that early church view of what a deacon was, to be in charge of the resources and to figure out how to share that in the midst of controversy and to do that in a way that's equitable. That is holy diaconal work. So I want you to claim what you're doing as not just a practical job that you do for the church, not something that's a kind of a have to do, but something that has a sense of holy calling and purpose to what you do. And when we do our work well, it heals places of potential conflict or of actual conflict in our congregations. Doing this work well really matters to the sustainability of our congregations, and not just in terms of the financial sustainability, but the emotional and spiritual sustainability, because when we do this work transparently and fairly, then we really nurture community. So now I want to turn to a different kind of consideration. And I advertised that I would talk about best practices, and I've mostly talked about the Bible. The Bible is a great source of best practices. So those best practices are to root ourselves in the conversation of generosity, to make this move from scarcity to abundance, to really see our work as diaconal, spirit-anointed work. But I do want to turn to some practical considerations. I want to do that by turning to some research that's available. Now, some of you may have already completed the Congregational Economic Evaluation Survey, and those results will be emailed out to you. I know at least one or two churches in the Hawaii conference already completed that survey, and I emailed those results out this morning. This morning for me, early morning for you all. And I'll do another set of those results on Friday. About once a week or every other week, I send out those email of results. What that survey does is it looks at the practices in your particular congregation and then sets them up in conversation with a national survey that was called the National Study of Congregational Economic Practices, or NSEP. This was a once-in-a-generation broad study of how congregations across America are raising, managing, and spending money. They looked not just at Christian churches, but of other faith communities and traditions as well. They looked at very big churches of tens of thousands of people, and small churches. I think the smallest one in this study was with a congregation of 8 or 12. So a real breadth in the size of congregations in the faith traditions congregations. They came up with a real picture of what is going on in churches, or in congregations, and in particular, what kinds of practices are associated with increased financial sustainability. So I'm going to share my screen again. So this study, NSEP, is available at nsep.org/reports. They have a 2-page version and a 38-page version of their report. Depending on the appetite in your church governance team, you might want to look at either the short or the long version of this report. They looked at a number of things that I'll tease out for you, and then I'll draw those conclusions about what best practices we need to focus on. So one thing they found that was kind of surprising for the authors of the study is that actually there's more churches that are increasing in the number of adults than are decreasing in the number of adults. So about 40% are increasing in size, 40% are decreasing. There's about a 20% in the middle that were staying flat. This is over a 3-year period, 2016 to 2019. I think that was the range. And then similarly, a lot of churches were increasing in revenue, some were decreasing. So often we get caught up in thinking that all church is declining, or everyone is facing this. You can actually look across the landscape of congregations in America and see there's a variety of experiences going on. And so then you can ask, what can we learn about where things are different? that we want to study. This was done pre-pandemic. I think during the pandemic, we'll have found these numbers are significantly different. Overall, the majority of support for congregation comes from individual donations, but churches are also receiving, or congregations receiving significant income from rental, special fundraisers, and endowment, denominational support, mostly for new church starts, which then skew it because they receive all of their funding from, say, a denomination. In a mainline church like the United Church of Christ, the income from endowments is often much higher than 4%, but these are the typical sources of income for congregations. These are the slides that I had mentioned that I thought you all were seeing. So increase and decrease doesn't necessarily line up. Some churches are increasing in the number of people and decreasing in revenue. Some are decreasing in people and increasing in revenue. There's a lot of variation across the board in congregations across the country. And we'll get to what some of the factors are actually that contribute to an increase in revenue in a few minutes. This then is that graphic of the different variety of sources of revenue for congregations. One thing that I think is interesting is whether or not congregations are doing pledge campaigns. Now, the study authors imagined that doing a stewardship campaign or pledge campaign would be correlated with an increase in revenue. But what they found was that there wasn't actually a correlation between whether a congregation did a pledge campaign or not, and their increase in revenue. Now, pledge campaigns remain very common in mainline Protestant congregations like the United Church of Christ. 70% of our congregations are doing annual pledge campaigns. But I think this is kind of surprising that this is not correlated with an increase in revenue. Now, I want to be clear, it's not that I'm recommending that you stop doing a pledge campaign, but rather I think we want to think about how we can make our pledge campaigns effective, and really what do we need to be doing all year around to be effective in our cultivation of generosity. So, and we can come back to this if you have more questions about that. Now, this is the study also looked at how people are accepting gifts during services. Now, this study was, of course, done before the pandemic. The majority were passing a plate. There were a couple of other options. What I think was interesting in this study was that having the ability to a text to give option for congregants was correlated with an increase in revenue. So it's one of those practices that we can identify now as a best practice. Having an option for online giving is correlated with increased revenue. I mentioned that because a recent CARD study, CARD is the Center for Analytics, Research, Data, and Development in the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. CARD are the people that, if you fill out your yearbook data, CARD is the office that's receiving that data from our local congregations. So CARD did a study of UCC congregations in September and asked how many of them had an option for people to make an online gift. And even halfway through the experience of the pandemic, only 2/3 of UCC congregations had an online giving option. So there's been a lot of resistance to online giving, and yet it's really one of those practices that's correlated with increased revenue. So then, and this is what I thought was kind of interesting, was how often are congregational finances explicitly discussed? Some congregations said never, and another 40% said yearly, which means that in half of congregations in America, finances are hardly ever explicitly talked about. I think the yearly means that there's an annual meeting which releases an annual report about the finances. So we'll look at some additional pieces about the frequency that there are conversations about finances. You might think about where you fall on the spectrum. Are you doing this weekly? Are you doing it never? Kind of where do you fall in the spectrum of talking explicitly about congregational finances? I'm a firm believer in transparency about finances, and that we ought to treat this as public information. that we share. So I would encourage you to be on that weekly, monthly side of it. When I was a local pastor, we had a financial dashboard, and I'll get to an example of what that looked like in a minute. We put that up on our website so anyone could look at our finances and see what was going on. We just felt like that was part of our call to be transparent. So this is one that I'll say at the outset. This was one the study authors found was a key. It was, how frequently is a church teaching about giving? That is, teaching about generosity as a spiritual practice. They found that about 20% of churches are talking about giving weekly or monthly. And then it goes down from there, with 40% or more, almost half, talking about it yearly or never at all. There's a real correspondence here about how frequently we talk about our finances to how frequently we're teaching about giving. I'm a little bit concerned that the folks that are only teaching about giving once a year are doing so in their pledge campaign, so that the one time that you hear an explanation of the spiritual meaning of giving is when the church is making an ask for money. I think it's really important for us to untangle those two things. So the congregation make an ask for support in an annual campaign, but that the pastor and the congregation be learning and teaching about giving all year round. So it might look like a couple of things. It might look like having a class about personal finances. It might mean having a conversation after church about how to teach your children or your grandchildren to be generous. Of course, conversations like that are also a great way to help the parents or the grandparents think about how they can be more generous. It might be a celebration of people who are embodying that definition of generosity that Christian Smith, that I used from Christian Smith earlier. There's a lot of different ways to be teaching about giving. You want your focus to be on teaching about it as a spiritual practice. Now, in this NCEP study, what the authors found was that this was the single factor most associated with increased revenue. So churches that were teaching weekly about giving, 90% of them were seeing an increase in giving. And the churches that taught about it monthly, 70% of them were seeing an increase in giving. What the authors of the study found was that there was no other factor that was more predictive of whether a church would see increased giving than whether or not it was teaching about giving weekly or monthly. Now, this is not the first study to show this. Barbara Fullerton, who is a member of the United Church of Canada, did doctoral research on giving practices in the United Church of Canada. And what she found was that there were lots of factors that related to increased giving. The more transparent a church was about its finances, the more you're doing things like a narrative budget, teaching about the impact the church was having. All of those mattered. But none of those worked if the church wasn't also teaching about giving as a spiritual practice. Now I think you're maybe guessing why it is that I wanted to frame your work as a treasurer or board of trustees or stewardship as a spiritual office, because we really, as a best practice, want to really claim generosity and talk about generosity in a spiritual way. So the question then, when we bring this together, I think that this is this question that emerges for me as we think about the roles that we have in our church. Do we teach and thank as often as we pass the plate? And that's a question that you can take back to your leadership team and that you can reflect on your own. What are the ways that we're teaching and thanking? So to give you an example, I belong to a local congregation. I love my local church. There's a lot that they do really great. They're not very good at thanking people. So, for instance, I paid off my pledge last year in March. So pandemic was unfolding and I realized my church might need financial support. So instead of waiting to the end of the year, which is typically when I make my gift, I made it in March. I didn't hear a thank you from the church until January, when I got a statement summarizing my annual contributions. That kind of, if I'm honest, it looked like a receipt from Jiffy Lube. It listed what I paid and that it was tax deductible, but it was not personal at all. I know that there are lots of churches that are treating donations this way. So we pass a plate every week. We ask people to give. We might tell people, hey, we're in trouble of not making our budget, but we're not thanking people. So if you're doing this if you're doing this reflection of you're teaching and thanking as often as you pass the plate, here's just some ideas that I would throw out here. I think you want to, if you're one of those churches that is only acknowledging gifts in January for tax purposes, I would encourage you to move to at least acknowledging gifts quarterly, so that every 3 months you're sending someone a note. Now, most nonprofits will send a note within 3 days. So at 3 months, we're kind of behind, but you want to at least do it quarterly. Then if you're sending those notes quarterly, I think you have some other times you want to send notes. You want to send it when someone makes a pledge. So if someone returns a pledge card, be sure to send them a note back thanking them. It doesn't necessarily have to be written by someone who's seen the number of what the person is giving. A member of the stewardship team can just write a note, thank you for making a pledge to our church. Your gift helps strengthen First Congregation of Honolulu or whatever the church is. Then the financial secretary should send a note when the person completes their pledge payment, when they fulfill their pledge. But also a great time to acknowledge a gift is when someone makes their first gift, either the first gift of the year or their first gift ever to the congregation. That's a particularly great touch point to thank someone for giving. Now, ideally, we would all move to where we're just regularly, at least weekly, thanking people for making their gifts. But I want us to think of making a reasonable step for whatever you're currently doing in expressing your gratitude to people who are making donations, to one step towards a more frequent expression of gratitude, with the knowledge that really the best practice is what secular nonprofits do, and that is acknowledging a gift within 3 days of receiving it. Often in our churches, we have a long ways to go from that. There's a question from Vivian. What if the finance committee keeps it only on their board of directors or councils? So Vivian, correct me if I'm wrong, but your question, I think, is around whether or not people are, who has the knowledge of what a pledge is. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is another kind of best practice issue. And so I will get to the specific question, but I want to get to it a little bit of a roundabout journey. One of the other factors that showed up in the NCEP data, the National Study of Congregational Economic Practices, was whether or not the clergy person knew what it is that people pledged. So what the study authors found is that in congregations across the country, the faith leader could access what people gave about 50% of the time. But of those, only half ever looked at what people were giving and pledging to the congregation, which means that, in reality, only 25% of faith leaders have knowledge of what it is people are giving and pledging to a congregation. Now, I think that's very true in the Aryan Church of Christ, where typically many of our pastors don't know what it is people are giving or pledging. But what the study authors found is that when the clergy person knows what people are giving and pledging, the church is more likely to see an increase in giving. So a statistically significant, I'm going to get tongue-tied. It was a good predictor of whether the church would see what an increase in revenue. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Foremost is that when our spiritual leader knows what we're giving or pledging, it's a sign that our giving is fundamentally a spiritual activity. So that's, I think, why it's important. The other is that it's a sign that stewardship and giving is a part of our discipleship. And if our pastor is going to be able to talk to us about our walk with Jesus, they need to be able to know this information. And then I think there's all sorts of practical information for pastoral care that a clergy person gets when they know this information. So I always had access to this information and looked. And when I would see either an increase in someone's giving or a decrease in someone's giving, or a start to their giving or a stop to their giving, would trigger a chance to do a pastoral check-in to see what was going on. Either their faith was deepening and growing, and they were maybe getting more excited about the church, or maybe they had hit some difficulty in their life, and either a job loss that wasn't yet known, or family issues. And so it became a reminder, or there was a frustration with the church. So this became a way to remind me of where I needed to do some pastoral care. So I think it's important that the first person who should know what people are pledging or giving beyond the financial secretary who's recording the gifts is the clergy leader. And I'll make sure that I share a resource. I recorded a video with Elizabeth Dilley on the pastor knowing, and that might be helpful for personnel committees that are looking at this question. I think, after the finance chair and maybe the treasurer and the pastor, I wouldn't not have a hugely wide circle of people who know what people are giving and pledging, because people in general, I find, want to keep that anonymous, or they want to know kind of where that information rests. So I think you can have a very effective stewardship committee that doesn't know exactly what people are, who is giving what. But you do need to have your top leaders, volunteer and staff, knowledgeable about this information, and they appropriately can hold that information. So to get back, I think, to Vivian's question, you can thank people for making a first gift, even if you don't know what that first gift was. If that it can be simply, dear Vivian, our financial secretary shared with me that you made a gift to our church, and I want to thank you for your generosity. Your support of our congregation is allowing us to do X, Y, and Z in the community. You're really helping us make a difference. Or, because of your generosity, our church is addressing really heartfelt needs in our community. This is what we're doing. There's ways to thank people without knowing the exact dollar value of what they gave. What you're commenting on and what you're appraising them for is the act of making a gift. So in addition to working on the thanking process and being more attentive and quick in our thank yous, that other piece of the equation is that teaching. And so to be regularly teaching about generosity as maybe less so as treasurers, but for those of you who are on the call, who might be a chair of a board of trustees or a moderator or council president or consistory president, there's really an opportunity here to do more layperson testimonials. I think we really, one of the study pieces that I didn't put up on the shared screen was around how often people hear a layperson talk about their giving. And in many churches, it's once a year or never. And frankly, that just makes me really sad. I don't think I couldn't conceive of going to church and not hearing someone pray, or hearing someone read the Bible, or in the UCC, hearing someone speak about justice. So we have those spiritual practices really well represented in our worship services. We want to do the same with talking about generosity, and to have an opportunity for people to share about why it is that they make a gift. Now, I don't know about you, but I often really think about, what are the reasons why I'm making a gift? And so I can say, what it is about an organization that excites me, why it's meaningful, how it connects to my heart, how it connects to my family's sense of mission. Inviting people to share those stories is a really beautiful moment. And also, again, thinking back to that Christian Smith definition of generosity, having people speak about ways in which they've given that are not monetary. What's the practice of generosity for them in terms of aid or encouragement or of time? Being fully and faithfully present to another person is such a tremendous gift. You can have testimonies about that and have someone share that about their act of generosity in that way. So now I want to turn a little bit and to think with you about the governance role for those of you who are in lay leaders in your congregations. So a book that I think is a great resource is this book, Governance as Leadership. It's about reframing the work of nonprofit boards. It grows out of the work of the Pew Charitable Trust. And they've done this great study on what makes nonprofits effective. They say basically as board members, we have 3 roles: fiduciary, strategic, and generative. But too often we get focused in just the fiduciary role. And even in that, we ask too narrow of questions. We ask, is the budget balanced? Often that's the kind of treasurer as curmudgeon role, where the treasurer is like insisting we have to have the balanced budget. We can ask a better question fiduciarily, and that is, how are we fulfilling our mission? You know, if you're getting ready as a treasurer to share the budget or a budget update with your congregation, print your mission statement as a congregation at the very top as the header of the report, and say, you know, the budget is really our attempt to answer and be faithful to this mission statement. So you want to not just look at the end of the financial report and see if we're balanced. You want to look at the beginning and see if we're following our mission statement. That is, those are the 2 things we want to keep our eyes on. Are we balanced? Is this sustainable? And is it meaningful? Does it matter? Is it missional? We can also ask strategic questions and generative ones. In a way, I've kind of done I like to work where we ask the generative questions first, which you'll notice that's why in our webinar, we started with what is generosity and what is our scriptural roots. Then to ask the strategic questions, which in this case meant that I turned to research. And then lastly, to ask the practical or fiduciary things, which is why now we're talking about governance. I organize when I have a board meeting. That's the order in which I create an agenda. Big picture generative questions, then strategic ones, and then last fiduciary ones. So I'd encourage you as you think about your role and your leadership in your congregation to work that way. You know, really that generative space is what Ron Hyphens was talking about on Saturday about the adaptive leadership questions. The generative mode is to ask those adaptive questions that we don't have an answer to, but are really key to asking. And it's hard to get in that space without an urgent crisis, but a good and strong board will always be leaning on those adaptive questions, those generative questions. Another best practice to look at is captured in this book by an article in this book by Rebecca Bassinger. And Bassinger writes about the role of congregations and or the role of leaders in the work of fundraising. And in particular, she lists up 3 things: that there's a role for individual leadership, that is, it begins with me. And really, I think that's a call or a reminder that if we're going to be involved in raising revenue for our congregations, we cannot be successful unless we ourselves are engaged in it. It's really a place of integrity that as a fundraiser, I don't think that I should ask people for gifts for organizations that I'm not willing to give to. I shouldn't ask people to do things that I'm not willing to give to. Now, I'm just going to tell a story of my dad. I love telling this story of my dad. He's a little tired of me telling it, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway. So for my dad, for a long time, was a very committed vegan, and he really believed in being a vegan. And he was almost evangelical about being a vegan. And he would tell me like why it was so great to be a vegan. And one day he's over at my house, and he decided to get something to eat out of the fridge. And so he pulls out some of my leftovers and starts eating it up and eating them. And he's telling me how great it is to be vegan. Now, the leftovers that he had pulled out were my baby back ribs. So if you can imagine, he's sitting in the chair eating a baby back rib telling me how I should be a vegan. It was not his most convincing sermon. We don't want to be fundraisers who are telling people to be vegans while we're eating baby back ribs. We have to engage in the work that we're asking people to do. And that's really what Rebecca Bassinger means when she says that it begins with me. But also, when we're creating a culture of generosity, it's something that we need to do collectively. You know, it begins with me, but it is also we, that you're not in this work alone, And you really can't create change for your culture, your community alone. You need to identify those people who are going to work with you in creating a more generous congregation. And lastly, that there's a role as lay leaders to be involved in growing leadership. So it's not just that it begins with me, but we're doing it together, but also continually cultivating who are going to be those next leaders in your congregation. This really applies financially. So you want to be thinking about faithfully doing your work as a treasurer, as a financial secretary, as a moderator, as a chair of stewards, but also thinking about who else can join me in this work? How can I bring someone else into this office? How can I train up the next leader who's going to take on this role? So next, I want to turn to another practical question that I want to encourage you to keep before your congregation. And that is, how do we catch donations? This is a question that one of my mentors asked me, and really to kind of probe me to look at what I was doing in my congregation. It's a woman named Michelle Thomas Dole. And so she wanted to say, how are we catching the generosity? How is my congregation catching generosity? So are you using a children's mitten or a catcher's glove? This is just about my only baseball metaphor. I'm not really into sports, so I don't want this to mislead you that I'm a sports fanatic, but I love this metaphor of what kind of glove are we using to catch people's generosity. And what Michelle was thinking about was the way in which people hold their assets in our country. So this was a study done, it was a couple of years ago now, but I think the basic pattern is the same. They looked at the portfolio of the top 20% in our country. We often talk about the 1% or the 5%, but this study looked at the top 20% of households in America, and found that a lot of wealth is held in a principal residence. That's where people live. About 10% in liquid assets, meaning like in a checking account or cash. More in a pension account and invested in the market, and then in businesses. Now, if we did take this up to the 1%, what we actually see is that business equity would increase, and liquid assets, cash on hand, would decrease. So now I'm going to think about the ways in which we typically ask for gifts in the church. Really, what we're mostly asking for is those liquid assets, those gifts of cash, either cash in an offering plate or a check, or maybe a text donation or an online bank transfer. But typically, we're only catching people's liquid assets. And so to develop out a catcher's mitt in your congregation, and this is really the best practice, you want to develop out that catcher's mitt so you can catch all of the ways people can be generous. You want to create ways to receive still cash and checks. You also want to start opening up ways to receive gifts of stock, that is from their securities, gifts from an IRA charitable distribution is a great way for people to make a gift out of their retirement savings. And then other planned gifts, other estate gifts. Often people can make their biggest gift of a lifetime through their estate. And so as church leaders, you want to be thinking about what are the ways in which you're really developing out that way for your congregation to receive gifts, a whole spectrum of gifts. Now, your congregation may not be set up right now to receive planned gifts, but the United Church Funds offers lots of resources to help with planned giving, to help with stock gifts, if you have an investment account with United Church Funds. And they can really be an asset in having that catcher's mitt for your congregation. So I want to take some time now for what questions you have. Let me just summarize the best practices that I think I was lifting up. So some best practices are, one, to root all of our conversations in our work as a spiritual practice, to reclaim and to talk about giving as that form of discipleship, to be teaching about generosity, to be thanking people for their gifts regularly, as often as you can, trying to get to that monthly or weekly pattern of both teaching and thanking people. To bring your pastor into the circle of knowledge about what people are actually giving and pledging to your congregation. as you practice your governance work, to be putting generative and strategic questions ahead of fiduciary ones. And when you're asking fiduciary questions, to be putting the mission front and center of your work. To be doing your leadership, doing your work from a place in which you as a leader are leading from a place of integrity, that you're doing what it is you're asking other people to do. Lastly, to have a robust way to see people's contributions. So I'd like to pause now and see what kind of questions or reactions or observations you might have. Are there places in your leadership role that you're running into difficulty, or a place where implementing some of these best practices you feel like might be a challenge in your context?
Andy, this is David. I do have a question. We often, as ministers and as leaders in a church, have been trained to tread very carefully around giving patterns and who's giving. You broach that a bit, but it's still, we feel guilty when we do that, right? And so it tends to hinder some of our more knowledgeable things that we would do. Do you have a sense of how we make that kind of paradigm shift from kind of this hands-off approach that we've been taught to more hands-on, for the sake of being more faithful with the resources of generosity that are within our churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my thinking about this was shaped a little bit by a recent book that Sarah Drummond has written. Sarah Drummond's the new founding dean of Andover Newton at Yale Divinity School. Andover Newton was an independent seminary that now has relocated and merged with Yale University, and it's now part of the Yale Divinity School. And so Sarah has written a book. She's done a lot of thoughtful work around leadership. She's written a book on discernment, and she talks about the three things that we need to be attentive to when we're engaging in discerning questions. And that is, we need to be mindful of our reason, our emotion, and power. And often in conflictual conversations in congregations, we might get think that we're debating about reason, when really people are motivated by emotion and really hooked by questions of power. So I think that's really helpful when we're looking at this question, to think about, there are all sorts of reasons that I can give you for why a pastor ought to know. But I think we ought to be attentive to what's the emotion behind it. Why is this a difficult place? And sometimes it's difficult to think about a pastor knowing, because there might be some issue of shame in our own relationship with money. There might have been past leaders who used that knowledge inappropriately, or past leaders who were inappropriate in their management of funds. That congregation ought to kind of do that archaeological work to find out where's that emotion at. There can also be issues of power. When I was a local pastor, I said, that I knew what people were giving. There was a woman in the congregation who was very vocal about how she thought it was appalling that I knew what people gave. And most people in the congregation thought that she was appalled because she was, she was the wealthiest woman in the church. And people thought, oh, she's just so embarrassed that Andrew knows what she gives. And that must, she's just so modest. She doesn't want Andrew to know that. But in truth, what she and I knew, because I had access to it, was that she gave very little to the church. And she really wanted the power that came from everyone thinking that she was the major donor of the church, who had to be consulted on every question. And it just really bothered her that I knew that was not true. She loved the social power that came from a lack of knowledge from the previous pastor. So there's a lot of power dynamics that come into play with money. They're not always as clear-cut as we think they are. It's not always that the pastor is going to defer to the person who's the major donor. It's sometimes that the person who's not the major donor likes the not knowing. Anyway, so I would attend to those three things. I would say if a congregation is thinking about this, the place to start this conversation is in the pastor parish relations council. It's in the personnel committee, and to talk about with the faith leader, what would this mean? How do they feel about it? How do the lay leaders feel about it? And to explore it there. I would say one of the things I think the conference does well, like our conferences do well, is boundary training for pastors. And that, part of our answer to making sure that pastors can faithfully handle this information is the kind of work that's happening in committees of the ministry and in boundary training that's equipping people to handle sensitive information appropriately. And lastly, I'll just mention, one of the places that really, not just the research that the Lake Institute did, but one of the things that really was an aha moment for me around this issue was reading Ibrahim Makindi's Stamped from the Beginning, where he looks at the 500-year history of racism as an idea. And he has a comment in there, a section on Cotton Mather, one of the early leaders in the congregational side of the church. And Cotton Mather wanted to send missionaries down to preach to enslaved Africans in the South. And plantation owners resisted this because there was a sense that if people who were enslaved converted to Christianity, then they had to be freed. And Cotton Mather said, no, that's not true. I'll care for their spirits, I'll care for their souls, and you care for their bodies. And that made me hear this conversation of pastors need to focus on spiritual things and not material things really differently. And I saw the relationship between white supremacy and this culture of secrecy, at least what I see as that. And I realized that for colleagues of mine who are pastors of African-American churches, that there isn't this question of the pastor not knowing. All of the Black pastors I know this information. And in my experience, many of my Black churches that I know have much more transparent and clear conversations around money than our predominantly white UCC churches that I deal with. So I think there are some historic reasons why we have this separation of pastors from knowledge about giving, and they're not great in my view. But I realize that this is a sensitive and hard topic. So proceed with caution. A question came up about how to ask for estate giving examples. So, one way to ask, particularly if you're just getting started, and stories are really key to helping inspire people for planned gifts. So one of the things I do as a development director is I will call up someone who I know has been either a leader in the conference or has been giving to the conference, and I'll say, we're trying to encourage planned gifts in the conference, and I realize that you're someone who has long loved the conference, and it occurred to me that you might have made a planned gift, and I'm wondering if you would share that story. And sometimes I find that person says, yeah, I have made a planned gift, and so I give this great story. Like I called a laywoman recently and asked my kind of intro question, and she told me about this really great gift that she has in her estate for her local church. It's beautiful. I called another person like that with that question, and they said, yes, I've got it in my will, and why don't we get together and we'll talk about what it is we have planned to do in our will for the conference. And when I arrived, as a husband and wife met me, and they were like, we pulled out our will last night to look at it, and we realized we had talked about making a planned gift, but we never completed it. So let's talk about how we can do this, and a third person I called like that, and they said, we've been thinking about making a planned gift, and this is what we want to do. And can you help us figure out how to make that happen? So I find that question, rarely are people insulted when you say, I know you really love the church and you might have thought about this. And it's hard to be insulted by that, right? Because, but another, way into this conversation, and I know that United Church Funds has some resources around this, is to invite people to do their estate, to think about their funeral planning and estate planning globally, and say in that, what kind of charitable legacy do you want to leave as you're making these plans. But there's an estate planning record that's available on the United Church Fund's website that can be a great adult education activity to encourage people to do some thinking. I think I would include in that a way for people to make a record of what their favorite hymns are and their favorite scripture and things like that that could really aid a pastor in planning a funeral. I know when I was a local pastor, when I planned a funeral for someone who had given me those kind of seeds, even someone who I'd known well, it really made the funeral feel much more personable because I knew this was really their favorite hymn. I realized I skipped over one thing that I promised I was going to tell you, and that was about some dashboards. So just real quick, I love metaphors. So if I told you a recipe and I said begin by preparing a mirepoix, some people would know what that was. Now I may have mispronounced the word in French because I only see it written. I don't really speak it much. And others would need to be told, you need to chop onions, carrots, and celery, saute them in butter, low heat for 20 to 30 minutes. Those are the same directions, but one form of the directions is more accessible than the others. Sometimes I think when we do financial reports to our congregations, we're using that first example. We're telling them to prepare a mirepoix when what they need to be told is saute onions, carrots, and celery. So when I like to, I like 4 dashboards that I think really help people who are not finance people by background understand where the church is. The first is to give them just a graph that's the actual versus budget for the congregation. So in this congregation, you can see income was behind their budget, but income was ahead of their actual expenses. So that was okay. And David, I'll email these out so you can see them. And a Excel spreadsheet to make it easy to create. So the first one is a snapshot of this. It gives a lay leader who's not versed in numbers an easy way to see how is the church doing. The next one is to do a running a dashboard on how is your annual campaign coming in. So the blue line is the historical average, so towards 100% of your goal. And then the red line is by the month of how are the pledges coming in. So you'll see the lay leaders here are able to really see, they could say, oh, well, in May, June, and July, we're doing really well compared to how we were in the past. But then you see it levels off and they end softer than their blue line, because what had happened in this case is that a bunch of people who gave in December gave like me in March, and it jumped up the numbers. This is really helpful to measure, are we going to make our budget? When I was a local pastor one year, I noticed in April, we were noticeably below our blue line. I was like, what's going on? I looked at our gifts coming in, and I knew that one particular family who gave our largest single gift hadn't made their gift. They are in a partnership, and so they gave their gift when their partnership payment came in March. They gave a good portion of that to the church, and they just hadn't made their gift. I reached out, checked in, everything was fine. Life had been busy, they hadn't made their gift. They made it, we caught up. But I was really glad to know that in April, instead of finding out in December that gift wasn't going to be there or was there, but needed to happen. It's really helpful for governance. Then looking at your investments, people, sometimes I see church committees that get the financial report, the investment report from the investment manager, and it's overwhelming. It's just too much information. I like an overall investment picture that lets people know, are we growing or declining? After our draw, we want to grow 3% a year. So are we matching our 3% growth to stay current with inflation? Again, this is an easier way, I think, for people to visualize what the numbers mean. And then lastly, if you have debt, again, don't just give people the numbers, give them a graph of what it looks like. So in this church, they had a loan, which they've been paying down, but they had a line of credit, which they paid down in 2019, and then 2020 came along and they had to draw some more on their line of credit. So they added some more debt. It gives people a way to manage and to imagine, what does that debt look like? I skipped over one that I'm going to go back to. That is to create a pyramid of giving. This can be very helpful for a board of stewards and a church council of looking at giving. I'll include some directions on how to make one of these. Essentially, you take the top 10% of your donors, and they're in the first tier. Your next 20% of donors are in the second tier, and your remaining donors are in the last tier. And it gives you a way to start to segment the different kinds of donors that you have. Someone with the knowledge will want to look at that first tier of donors and pay attention to their demographics. So one church I know realized that in their top tier, they looked a little more like the Space Needle in Seattle. It was, like tall and soaring, and it was one particular gift at the top of their pyramid was a significant portion of their budget. And it was coming from a couple that was in their mid-90s, and the husband had just died, and the church realized, oh my gosh, we're not going to receive this gift forever. You want to pay attention to who's in that top tier and what their demographics are. If your top giver is in their 30s or 40s, they might get a job somewhere else and move away. So it's not just death that's the danger there. You want to be aware of what the demographics are in that top tier of givers, because proportionally they represent a significant portion of the church budget.
Andrew, I had a comment to make. Let's see, I think a large percentage of our membership, in terms of their own personal finances, are more hand to mouth.
Yeah.
And they also project that on the church, that the church sort of operates, especially if we're looking at available cash, hand to mouth finances.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about other personal areas of wealth to tap into, it can make the church seem a little greedy, if we're not careful. But I'm also wondering if the church itself needs to look at other ways of supporting itself, because this is a model of looking at the church operating only from contributions from its members and not at other sources. And the other problem but I think about is that what happens if the church, the church always is behind in its budget. But what happens if the church is exceeding the amount that it has more than what they budget? And then how comfortable are members when they realize that their church has a huge savings that they're not spending, and they're still asking you for money? So there are some other kinds of problems in the way that we're set up, because certainly mission and vision have an important role in this also.
Rob, those are two really important observations, and I'll try to get to both of them. So I do think you want to think about the experience of your own congregation and the setting for how to talk about money in that local congregation. In a congregation where people are more paycheck to paycheck, talking about even an annual pledge drive can be really hard, because it's hard for people to conceptualize what is that year-long picture going to look like. And to talk about making significant gifts when people are not sure where $500 would come from in an emergency is delicate, to say the least. At the same time, I know that communities that don't have a lot of financial resources people are often much more generous, certainly as a percentage of their income, than wealthy communities. And you see that, across the country, that there's generosity and income or earnings are not correlated in terms of how generous someone is, or they are correlated, and it's the people who have less economic resources tend to be more proportionally generous. I think one of the things that comes up in the study is the importance of having classes and teaching about personal financial management. And I think that there's really an opportunity for us to do that in our churches. I see the need for some resources around like curriculum and lesson plans for how to do this in our churches in a way that's reflective of our faith and values. I don't have a curriculum to hand to you to say, here, run with this. So stay tuned. I see the need to create something. But I think that, I would love if there are experiments going on in our congregations, I hope you would send me your great ideas of how you're doing this, because I think there's a lot of faith formation that can happen for our people about how to wisely, manage their finances. and that we can share those resources across our denomination. So if you have a good way to do this, I'd love to know about it. And you mentioned what it's like for people to be living paycheck to paycheck and have the church be asking for more and more funding. I think we want to, that's an important conversation to have. I think one of the places that I go for in Scripture when I think about how it is that we fund the church is that passage from Acts 2. After Pentecost, you'll have guessed that I love the Acts of the Apostles. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. I go to it all the time. But in the end of Acts 2, there's a description of the early church holding all things in common, each giving as they had to any who had need. And I really think that that's an important reminder for us about what it is to be in a church community, that we're called to support one another. And not all of us may be in a moment where we can make a gift to the church, but others of us can give more. And particularly as our country goes into what they're calling a K-shaped economy, where lots and lots of people are losing jobs and wondering if they're going to be evicted while the stock market soars. I mean, we're in a split, a split economy, but our congregations may also be that way. And so, Rob, while many people may be living paycheck to paycheck, there may be people who are not in that financial reality, either because they're on a fixed income of Social Security or for other reasons, have more stability. I think there's a conversation to have, can people support the church? You also said around the piece around the church accumulating savings and assets. I think that's, in the UCC, we ask just questions about justice and about resources. And I think that's one that we really want to attend to in our movement about, what are we building up resources for? What is an endowment for? What are we holding on to this wealth for? And that really gets to what is our mission and values and how are we living that out? A question came up in chat around financial stewardship class for our congregations. I know that I need to grow in this area of having some resources available to hand out. And our evangelical sisters and brothers have a lot more resources available. I'm not sure they always fit who we are. The kind of Dave Ramsey model is really popular out there. I'm looking for what's the progressive version of that. And I promise to keep on the hunt, but I don't have it yet.
At the beginning of the chat, Andrew posted his email address. So if you think of anything, please feel free to contact him. So again, we want to thank Andrew Warner for joining us this afternoon. Yay!
Thank you for having me.
And I hope that this will be helpful for you and your churches. So again, thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for being here.
Take care, blessings.